I was thinking about some stuff that happened in the 50s before I was born, and I was always wondering about it. But I was a little kid. My mom would drive the store, and a policeman in the 80s. Some of the cars they didn't have. I'm not a brown nose to the police. So who wants to talk to the police and be in trouble for hours, or like get stopped for and delay your, your ride or whatever to the store an hour. But I definitely am not going to beat them, and nobody can hardly outrun the police if you are in trouble. But anyway, in the 50s, a lot of the junk cars, the odometer would read 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, and the police did not have radar guns, because in the 90s there was a song, it was a rock and roll song, it was a classic rock song, it was a good dancer at the bar and said, I'm having fun, I got a minimum wage job, but I'm having fun with my radar gun. It was kind of a good song to dance to in the 90s, but not one of those memorable hits that everybody remembers. But anyway, because in the 50s they didn't have radar guns, but some of the junk cars that were like an older model, the gas gauge or the speedometer gauge would read 10, 20, 30, 40 miles an hour, and anything between you kind of had to guess how fast you were going. And then if your parents or whatever had kind of a better car, it would say 10, 15, 20, 30, 35, 40 miles an hour, and then you could tell where the needle was. A little bit better than some of the really junkers back then. But back in the day, if you had a big V8 car, that was a huge, they called them like, what was they called? A V8, what was they called? Crown Royal boats, or they had other ones that were big boats. I can't remember, LTD boats. They were super long. The roads have not changed, they're the same size, but if you're at a stoplight, because a couple of people in school had them, if you turned left or turned right or was at a stop sign going to go right, well, you could go forward, and that's about the only way you could go. Because if you turned left or right and you were at a four-way stop, or you just had a left turning lane or in the right turning lane, your car was so big and the roads have not changed, and you would hit the person, so you would have to utterly be alone to turn left or right, and you could only go straight. And a lot of people were nervous because if you kept going straight, then you could go all the way. But if you had to turn left, you were blocking traffic because you had those giant cars. But anyway, in the 50s, you had your checking account, running account books, and all the banks were owned by NFSDI, or what was it called, NSDI or something, all the checkbooks. And if you're at work or whatever, you worked at the Dairy Suite and you're a woman or something, or a man, a janitor, or if you were in a factory or a bank or whatever, or a doctor or whatever, when you had this thing called a registry, and you had to write how much you subtracted from your checkbook, and then what checks were out there floating that hadn't been cashed yet, and you always had to write, when a check came in, you got a letter from the bank that said they cashed that, you'd have to subtract it. But if you lost the bank letter and you didn't know what was already subtracted, and then you thought you had so much, the decimals would be wrong. And there was basically only one checking account bank for everyone, NFSDI or whatever it is, but NAST or whatever it was. But you could always use cash, but there were certain places you couldn't use cash. And like I said, if you just got one number wrong, it messed up your whole checking account every time. But by the time, if you only had I'm sorry, I'm uneducated, but if you only had like $1,000, you only spent like $100, but then you wrote another check for like $10 or $15, your whole checking account was messed up a lot. But because the numbers, if it didn't come in already to the bank and you didn't know, and you were like third check, then your decimal points were all off, and you would get a bad check. And back in the day, they would accuse you, or they would say it was check fraud, and that you robbed the bank. And if you were like $35 short on your checking account, the bank would close your account, and the first time you'd have to, it was pretty serious. It was like probation from the police. You would have to pay that back. And it was basically like being on 6-month probation, like when you get your first DUI. But anyway, if you got a second one, and you wanted to go borrow money from your grandma or your mom or something, say, hey, I need $35, my checking account's short, I'm going to put in jail, and she'd be like, I don't like you, the black, you did me wrong, go away. you would go to jail, and a lot of times the second or third offense was like 5 to 10 years in jail, in prison, for check fraud, because it was considered stealing from the banks and the government. And even if it was a little bit of money and you couldn't get it right away, you were still immediately sentenced to 5 to 10 years in prison for check forgery. And if like you had a wife and kids or whatever, like in the 50s, and let's say you had newborn babies or toddlers, and your wife was a stay-home mom, but you were, at work, whether, like I said, doctor, whatever, wherever you worked at as a man, you had to stay there all day. And if the checkbook was off, you couldn't, and your wife had to stay home with the toddlers and couldn't leave them alone. If you couldn't leave, you would, if the checking book, it's very easy to mess up a checking account back then. You would have to go to prison. And then when you got out of prison, 5 or 10 years, your wife wasn't going to wait on you with those little kids. I mean, for 5 or 10 years for you to get out of prison, if you even did. So she would normally find another man. And the telephone companies, if you lived in that town, it was public. But if she moved out of the county, you'd have to know somebody that knew where she lived at. And all those love songs were like, operator, can you help me? Tell me, where my wife is. Now they got out of prison or whatever. For check forgery. And the prisons were tough, but a lot of those songs were like that. But anyway, what was I going to say? Oh, and then there was the Hells Angels that were running people over, because the cops, like I said, if like the cops didn't have those radar guns, so you'd have to be in the daytime, you'd have to be almost deaf, dumb, and blind and stupid to know there wasn't a policeman behind you. But the policeman had a job to do too, because if you're at a stop sign, you could have gotten an accident with somebody, and then you were wanted for hurting somebody, because back then you'd go through the windshield and be seriously hurt. You know what I'm saying? If you T-bone somebody at or they call it T-bone, if you're turning left or right, like I told you, and did a hit and run, you were seriously injured. I mean, you were wanted. But, and then the police had their job. They had to, like, certain people to do, but they didn't have a lot to, or they didn't know, they'd have to do a traffic stop, but you'd have to be deaf, dumb, and blind, because without those radar guns, the police would have to be behind you, like an old lady or something, for 3 or 4 or 5 miles, and they'd have to almost be a stalker, like a love stalker. They have to be right behind you and do the exact same miles an hour as you, but not move, like when you're towing with a rope or a chain. And they'd have to go behind you like 2 or 3 miles to make sure it was pretty accurate, so people didn't get angry back when they had to pay the ticket with possibly a checkbook. You know what I'm saying? But because if you're, if your speedometer was like, it said the 10s and the 20 increments, but his said the 15, and the 5 increments, then they would kind of contest it, and it was kind of hard to prove it accurately, because you look at your speedometer, and it's, in between, and some were funny shaped to make the models of the cars look cool, and it was hard for the police to accurately tell. But anyway, and then if you got an accident, but then if you got, if you had a right check, you were in jail for like 5 or 10 years, and with the telephone lines, the public and the private, if you moved out of town, you could never look up to call the operator and say, hey, my man lives over there in a different state, but I know exactly where he lives. And they're like, well, you have to go there and find out who it is. And if you had a private number and didn't want to be bothered, then you'd never be able to find that person again. And a lot of, what was I going to say? But things are still going on evilly, you know what I'm saying, with the government. But I was just thinking about all those people that, because that song Quiet Riot, when I was a little kid, I used to think, I had a phobia of writing a bad check and, getting check forgery. But if you're in jail, well, they throw you in prison like the second time, because it was considered concealing. There was only one bank in the whole United States, that NFCI, that controlled just about all the checks. All the checking and balance. All the banks, they had different names, but it all went to the same routing account number. And like on the second or third time, if nobody would loan you money, like if they thought you were ugly or something and didn't loan you the money, it was considered check forgery. And you would do automatic 10 years in prison, or 5. I mean, if you don't believe me, you can ask somebody. But and then your wife or something, you can take off from work every 5 minutes to run to the bank, but your wife's got the toddler or something, she can't throw them on the floor, and they're in diapers. And that's what happened to one of my friends. She's dead right now, but she was taking care of the diaper, or the kids, and they were like, like 6 months or something. They were kind of still in diapers late. and her husband, they didn't have the money, and they were living, and he went and robbed a store, and he had to go to prison. But yeah, because of that. And I always wondered why she did that. I thought she was being evil, and she wasn't. And then he died in there. He got murdered or something because he had to do 10 years for robbing a bank or a grocery store for the diapers. She told me it's for the diapers, but she felt bad because he died, and she loved him and stuff. But yeah, he died in prison because he had to rob it for the diapers. There's nobody that would loan him money and said they were smoking cigarettes that looked like hoodlums or whores or whatever. But yeah, that's my stupid story. But if you can, it took me a while to figure all that out. But if you listen to some of those old classic songs, and they're like, operator, I can't find my wife. And back then, the Social Security numbers and the names on people were, a lot of people didn't know who their fathers were, and they were handwritten in cursive if you can read the cursive, and so were the Social Security numbers. But they tried to change out with typewriters, but like I said, the government still makes evil mistakes. But that's probably why there's so many I don't know, baby boomers or something that are so full-hearted, full of love, because there were so many people, because they figured out, they were older than me, that figured out that, if their dad hit somebody, and then the Hells Angels always driving around trying to kill people. And you know what happened? Well, what I got the story was, John Lennon, the Beatles, he'd already had 2 or 3 families. He just wouldn't talk to them. He had Julian Lennon, then he had those other 2 kids with Yoko. And people hated him so much because the Beatles were always like, I got perfect love and perfect money, and he was like in the streets, and somebody shot him in the back because they couldn't get love. Like, they didn't have a house, or they were ugly or schizo, and couldn't get love, and they shot him in the back. And then you had the Charles Manson stuff, and then you had the Hells Angels and the police who didn't really accurately know how fast people were going. Then they had caffeine pills back then that were considered kind of like cocaine, mini thins, or the caffeine pills that you buy at the drugstores, NoDoz or whatever. There's caffeine pills for truckers that stay awake at night delivering groceries or furniture to your house, so they wouldn't fall asleep at the wheel. But you had the Kennedys saying, well, we're 8 kids and we're super rich with a New York accent, and we're presidents, and all the girls, all your wives, going to be sitting around taking care of the kids in the diapers, and they're going to be, thinking that we're hot and sexy football players from New York on TV, and you're going to be at home or at work worrying about your checkbook, worrying if you're going to go to prison for 10 years. And that was like the 50s and the 60s. And, they shot John Lennon in the back because he was a hypocrite, saying, we got perfect, pretty music, and your wife will be at home singing this daydreaming and watching soap operas, and you'll be at work wondering if you're going to prison for a bad check for 10 years and a padded, quiet, riot rubber room. But it's not quite like that, because there's no, White Houses for free. There's no mental institution life for free, and prison is definitely not good. But yeah, I thought of that, trying to figure it out all these years, and I figured it out later.